ready? Great. Good morning, everyone. Very warm welcome to everyone who's joined us here today. This is typical Glasgow weather. I know you've had a few days of beautiful sunshine, but as a former student here, I can tell you that this is really what Glasgow's like. So we got very lucky here. And thanks to everyone who's joining us online as well. So my name's Jebi Rahman. I'm really delighted to be moderating today's session. Food, the forgotten climate driver. How can you help transform the food sector? So I work for the Climate Group. It's an international not-for-profit, and we focus on systems with the highest emissions. And we work with networks of businesses and state and regional governments. And we work in areas where they have the highest sort of opportunity to drive climate action fast. So we have a lot of experience working in the energy, transport, built environment and industry sectors, but food is really an emerging system for us, so really delighted to be here with our panelists today. So yeah, this session is about the global food system is responsible for 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions and is among one of the most vulnerable sort of sectors to climate impact. And yet it really gets little attention and focus in the international and national policy arenas. So really what we're trying to do in this session is highlight the importance of the food system within climate action and the international climate regime, and the role that food and drink companies can play in this. So I just want to tell you a little bit about the work that sort of the Climate Group does as the Secretariat to the Under 2 Coalition. So we've been involved in the Glasgow Food and Climate Declaration, and this declaration is open to signatures from subnational governments around the world. And it recognises the need to act through integrated food policies and greater action from national government. So it's been signed by about 90 cities and subnational governments, and actually I think the event is taking place today at Glasgow City Chambers just as we speak. So it's really appropriate that on the business action side I'm joined by the companies here today. So I'm really pleased to be joined by 3 trailblazing companies in the food and drink sector to talk about their role in driving the shift to a more sustainable food system and the position they want policymakers to take to ensure the food system is getting the attention it needs during leading climate negotiations. So firstly, I want to thank Oatly for organising this session. We're joined today by Ashley Allen, Chief Sustainability Officer at Oatly. We've got Kevin Rubinovich at Global Sustainability Vice President at Mars, and also Patrick Brown here on my left, CEO and founder of Impossible Foods. So thank you all for joining us today. We've got just under an hour together, and I think we'll try and have a few minutes at the end for Q&A from the audience. But we've actually got a lot of questions, so let's see how we get on. So I'd like to begin by asking each of you if you could briefly introduce yourself and your company and tell us why you're participating in COP26. I'm going to start with Kevin, way over on the left there, because I think he's been here already for a week and he's ready to leave tomorrow, so we'll come down this way.
Yeah, great. Thanks. Thanks for the handover and thanks for the invitation, Ashley and Oatly and everyone. Yeah, very happy to be here. Kevin Rubinovich. Maybe to maintain the C-suite streak, I should have gone with my Chief Climate Officer title. I've been at Mars for 27 years. I lead our environmental program globally, not just climate, but all things environment. And yeah, I mean, it's ironic for us to see a panel, food the sort of forgotten, notion, because we've been working on it hard for many years. So it's great to see that coming to the front and being more of a focus, not just sort of the industrial side of the economy, but the agricultural part of the economy. And so that's one of the reasons we're here at COP. And I'd say really the other major reason we get involved in COP, which fundamentally is about what the policymakers are trying to drive, is we will not solve this through voluntary action in the private sector. There is a critical role for regulation that's been carefully and thoughtfully designed and implemented, but really that's absolutely necessary to solve the problems at the scale that we're trying to address. So that's why we're here. It's been great. We've been here since Monday. Our CEO has been here speaking at a number of events. So he's a Scot, so he was very excited to come home. Yeah, it's been a great week so far.
Thanks so much, Kevin. Ashley.
Yeah, thanks, Jebi. So sometimes when I introduce Oatly, it's one of two reactions that I get. You know, either what the heck is Oatly? Did you say Oakley, like the sunglasses? Or the other reaction I get is, oh my God, I love Oatly and I have it in my fridge. And then someone takes a picture and sends it to me the next day. So for those of you who don't know Oatly is a plant-based food company, really an oat milk company. But if you ask our CEO, Tony Peterson, he'll tell you, no, Oatly is not an oat milk company. Oatly is a sustainability company that produces oat milk and other oat-based foods. And really what's behind that is just this notion that's been built in the company since it was founded in Sweden 30 years ago, which is just, you know, how can you produce a product that is actually good for people on the planet? And that sort of provides that alternative to people who either can't have dairy, you know, don't want to have dairy, you know, understand the environmental implications, the health implications, things like that. And that mindset, that idea that a product can actually contribute in a good way to the world is what is really been driving the company and is really driving our participation here. I mean, we see, kind of like Kevin said, you know, Oatly's been working on sustainability for so many years, but really in the last couple of years has sort of connected that with the policy world, connected that with, you know, what is happening with some of these larger global issues. And the company's been pretty surprised to find that actually food doesn't get a ton of attention at things like the COPs. And just to confirm that, we went through the UNFCCC agenda and we looked at the COP26 main agenda, and truth be told, no food, no agriculture on that main agenda. Of course, there's research that goes on, there's meetings and stuff, but it really doesn't have the focus that the issue deserves when in fact 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions come from the food sector. And so that's really what we're here talking about. Just to, you know, we know that the people at COP are the people that really care, and a lot of people that are really engaged in the finance sector, really engaged in the energy sector, and we just want them to, you know, have an appreciation for food as well, and really start to think about as countries make their national commitments, as countries set their NDCs, where does food play a role in that? And how, you know, as such an amazing economic driver in so many economies, how can agriculture also, you know, play a big role in their climate commitments and in their NDCs? So that's why we're here. That's what we're talking about this week.
Thanks, Ashley. That's great. And over to you, Patrick.
Okay, so, sorry. Whoa. The company I founded, Impossible Foods, the reason it exists is not that I ever wanted to be in the food business or business at all, but 10 years ago, I was an academic scientist at that time, and when I was looking at trying to get a deep understanding of the two biggest threats basically humanity has ever faced, which is the catastrophic collapse of global biodiversity, which is probably a bigger problem, bigger threat to us than climate change, but it doesn't have a conference, unfortunately, and climate change, and that the number one contributor to both of them isn't the food system, it's animal agriculture. That industry is by far the most destructive industry on Earth, most destructive industry in human history, and the only way that we're going to basically prevent a catastrophic end to both of those issues is to find a way to essentially eliminate our dependence on animals for food. And I decided that was possible, and that's why I founded the company. We talk about food and climate, but really the only part of the food system that's a serious problem, threat to climate, is animal agriculture. And the same is true for biodiversity. So I sometimes feel like when it comes up as food and climate, it's sort of like to hide the fact that it's all about animal agriculture and all about livestock. You don't have to talk about lettuce and radishes and crops that humans eat. Anyway, for climate, I think the main message I want to deliver here is that there's an amazingly powerful way for us to essentially halt the progression of climate change in the next 15 years and get ourselves a 30-year pause in ongoing net greenhouse gas emissions by completely replacing animals in the food system, which I think is doable. And Impossible Foods, the way we're doing it, basically, so the company exists because of climate and biodiversity, not because I want to get in the food business. But the way that we're approaching it, what I realize is the only way we're going to solve it is not by convincing governments to change their policies, but more subversively by creating the most delicious, nutritious, and affordable meat, fish, and dairy foods in the world and making them directly from plants. That's what we do. And I would say at this point, we have a very strong proof of concept that our technology platform is working on all those counts. And I'm not here to advertise Impossible Foods, but it's going to happen.
Thanks for the introduction, Patrick. And we're going to come back to some of that later on. So, yeah, really helpful to kind of set the scene. So we've had a couple of major announcements at COP so far, which are relevant to food and agriculture space. One's around deforestation. I think more than 100 countries are committing to stopping and reversing deforestation by 2030. And then the second one was around the Global Methane Pledge, with more than 80 countries committing to reduce methane emissions by 30% by 2030. So I'd like to turn to you first, Kevin. What is the private sector and Mars's role in this decisive decade?
Yeah, thanks. A bit loud. I think deforestation certainly is something that has been on the radar of certainly at least the leaders in the private sector and in the food supply chain for more than a decade. I think the challenge is when a lot of attention crystallized around that in maybe, let's say, 2010, the theory of change that was being pursued was, get your certification in place on the volume that you're buying, and a sort of slightly naive idea that if 20-30% of the market asks for deforestation-free commodities, that somehow 100% of the supply base will convert their practices in pursuit of that 20 or 30% of demand. And that's not how markets work, right? If 20% of demand wants something, eventually 20% of supply will be there to meet it. And so that's one of the reasons that I think while we have made progress, we haven't really accomplished the goal that I think everyone ultimately aspired to, which is ending commodity-driven deforestation. And so that led to some work that we did and helped lead with a number of our peers through the Consumer Goods Forum into what became eventually the Forest Positive Coalition. And really there were sort of three key ideas, two of which were initially focused on, and the third which we're pushing now as well. And the first idea was that managing our individual supply chains was not going to lead to transformation. So if I'm buying 50,000 tons of whatever, palm oil, cocoa, soy from you as my supplier, I need to be asking you not about the 50,000 tons that I'm buying, but about the million tons that you sell to everyone. And that's how I need to evaluate you as a supplier, not whether you can do what I want just on the volume you're selling me, but whether you're someone that only does business in that way. And that's a really transformational approach to managing supply chains. Really, it's going from managing supply chains to managing suppliers as businesses. So that's one big push. The second one is recognizing that even with that more comprehensive approach, in many cases, the drivers of deforestation aren't linked to a single commodity. It's happening in a landscape where there are multiple pressures, multiple commodities. Some of them may not even be food. There could be rubber, there could be mining, all kinds of other things. And so sometimes you actually need to engage at landscape level and really sort of, not just have sort of a blind commodity coming from somewhere, but really engage in, what's going on at that landscape, what are the drivers, what's the role that, your commodity procurement and your company can play in that process. And then the third one, which is quite relevant as we're here in COP and comes back to the question you asked, is, there's absolutely a role for policymakers to play here, right? Both on the sort of carrot and stick side of things. And that, in a way, is what's so compelling and exciting about the recent announcement is, that essentially leans into the exact same idea of this clean supplier versus supply chain. When a national government says, I'm not going to let you import into my country anything that hasn't been produced in the right way. That's a clean supplier sort of mentality. And so I think it's great because it creates an opportunity for sort of reinforcement. On the methane, I guess the comment I would make is, I think there's been quite a bit of attention to methane leakage directly from the fossil sector, right? So you hear about leaking wells and landfill methane and things like that. But ag methane and methane from food waste is on the order of half of global methane emissions. And so I think this is just another great example where certainly if you're a food business and you've been worried about the footprint of your business, you're aware of methane if it's in some of the materials that you buy, either some of the animal materials that that Patrick's not a big fan of, or things like rice. So it's been on our radar for a while. We've been working on it, and so bringing more attention to it, having governments care about it, having governments think about maybe I should do something in my agricultural policy that, again, carrot or stick incentivizes things that will reduce methane is terrific, and we're thrilled to see it.
Great. No, lots of really interesting points there, Kevin, and really that kind of push to sort of regulate the whole sort of ecosystem and kind of not just be looking at your individual supply chains, but also what you can do. I know there is a lot of commodity sort of roundtables and kind of looking at that sort of collectively. That's great. I'm just going to stick with you for a minute more, Kevin. Sustainable agriculture, it's a hot topic in recent months, but it's not so widely practiced. Are regenerative agricultural practices really viable at scale, or really is it just something in the margins?
Yeah, so I guess my first comment here would be I have a sort of allergic reaction to programs built on practices, right? Our sustainability program, the Sustainable Generation Program, probably should have said that sooner, the name of the program at Mars. All of our goals are about impacts. Right? So it's about, are we reducing our greenhouse gas footprint? Are we not expanding the land footprint of the agriculture that it takes to supply our business? Are we reducing water use in stressed watersheds? I think there needs to be more sort of both focus on impacts and then accompanying that a little bit more sort of flexibility and freedom on methods, right? So I think, in some ways it's easier to say, go do this practice and you're all good. But we've seen over and over again that our understanding of the actual consequences and impacts of various practices sometimes aren't quite what we thought they were at the beginning. And if you get overly focused on the practice and not laser focused on the impact, you can go down the wrong path. And so I think there's a lot of strategies that are framed under the sort of broad and very fuzzy edged definition of regenerative agriculture, and there's probably a few things that many people would agree on. There's a number of things where people would probably violently disagree whether it is or isn't regenerative agriculture. And so I think I worry, so I think there's absolutely opportunities. I worry we get distracted arguing about whether this strategy or that strategy belongs in the definition, when really the argument should be about, I did this thing and it cut my greenhouse gas footprint 27%. Okay, good, let's do more of that, right? And so I think that should be the focus. But again, I think there's been an incredible level of innovation in the renewable energy space that is now translated to innovation at scale. So in that sort of R&D and D, we're past that second D, right? It's kind of no big deal to throw up a 200 megawatt wind farm. You just need a bit of money and a bit of time, and it's not a thing. We're not there yet in agriculture. I think there's a huge amount of innovation. I think the other thing that's interesting about regenerative agriculture is, to use a term that has not gotten as much airplay recently, but it's a sort of form of biomimicry, in the sense of many of the solutions that are advocated under regenerative agriculture are sort of harnessing and leveraging the capabilities of nature. Right, so cover crops is all about using nature to pull down carbon and sequester carbon and fix nitrogen and things like that. And so I think that's an exciting trend. As I'm sitting here looking at this wall, the word nature is jumping out at me, right? And so it's sort of harnessing the capabilities of nature in service of solving our problem, which I think is a very encouraging trend as well.
Thanks, Kevin. That's great. Sure. Come on in.
Just to add on that real quick, because I sort of agree and disagree with you, Kevin. I think what I disagree on is it really depends on your perspective where practices come in. So, for most companies, I'm sure that getting involved in individual agricultural practices mostly shouldn't be probably part of your business model. But there's some cases where I think it does make sense. And I'll give the Oatly example. We work with oat farmers in Sweden. We work with oat farmers in the US. And actually, I call them oat farmers, but they're most often like corn, soy, often livestock, and oat farmers, because oat comes in at a sort of portion of the farm or at a certain season. And for us, so dependent on one particular commodity and so focused on one particular system. I mean, oats make up more than 50% of our ingredient footprint, and a huge chunk, like 25 or 30% of our greenhouse gas footprint, just from oats. So not everything, but just from oats. And oats aren't a high-emitting crop. Like, I'm not talking about beef. There's no meat in Oatly. So oats already are low emission. So that just shows the volume that we really put into our products. And so for that, like, we do get really involved in what are the practices around growing oats. And what we've found is when you're working at that level and you're forming relationships with farmers, they do actually want to get down to that level of, like, what are the specific practices. They don't necessarily want to be told, we want you to do this practice and not that practice. So that's what I totally agree with you. We've found that it's really different. Agriculture is so local. It's different in each place. Regenerative, some places is an acceptable word, some places is not. And so it's really much more about working with the farmers, providing that agronomist to work with them, and then together, defining what are the things that actually do achieve the impact you want. What are the things that are going to increase soil carbon sequestration, increase biodiversity, and really important to them, increase their diversification and different income streams. And that's really what they're looking for. So when you work at that level, it is important to get to practices. And I expect that for national governments, for agricultural agencies, that's pretty important as well. Because I think a lot of farmers really rely on some of the guidance that comes out of extension services that are supported by the farmer agencies, and when those extension services provide the wrong advice, that's when the entire system really heads in the wrong direction. And if we can get some of these, whether you call them regenerative or restorative or just good practices, if we can get that into the extension services, into the guidance provided by national agricultural agencies, that's when I think we start to see that scale that we need.
Thanks, Ashley. I think you've actually started answering the question we were going to throw you. So it's interesting to hear from Kevin. With him, it was about the end goal in mind and practices. We could be a bit more flexible so long as we were making that impact. But I think what you're sort of saying is actually there are some best practices that are helpful to sort of share. So you've kind of talked us through a bit about this. What about the farmers when companies like Oatly sort of approach them about things like regenerative agricultural practices? How do they react? And what do they need in order to make that change? I don't know if there's anything you want to add to what you were saying.
I think it's a great question, because I think in some ways, I don't have any evidence of this, so it's dangerous to say, but I suspect that one of the reasons that food doesn't get a high place on the agenda and agriculture doesn't really get the attention it deserves at events like this is that people are a bit afraid of pissing off the wrong person. People don't want to make farmer organizations mad. I mean, farmers really are both on the front lines of climate change, clearly, but then they're also the champions of change. They are the people who can make the difference. So they're quite powerful in many economies in that way. And so I think there's a little bit of fear of, if you start bringing up agriculture, you start telling farmers what to do, which is not what we want to do, but that's somehow how some people can take it. Then it's going to be mutiny. It's going to be horrible, and we have not found that at all. And I think part of it is just going into that conversation openly. And I think I mentioned. We work with oat farmers, but many of them have animal agriculture as well. That's many smaller farms, and so it's family farms. They have multiple different sources of income, multiple different products on their farm, and so we don't discriminate. We don't say like we won't buy oats from you unless you get rid of all of your livestock. We don't say that, but we do want to show them that there can be a higher economic incentive for producing food for people, so that they can get more value, more money from producing crops that people are going to eat than for animals. And just demonstrating that and working with them, we find really a lot of acceptance, a lot of excitement, a lot of enthusiasm. And so we've had really great relationships with farmers approaching us and saying, hey, you're Oatly, you buy oats. I've been growing oats for livestock. What do I need to do to sell oats to you? And can you work with me? What can you do to support me in this? And you know, I really, we have not hit the kind of backlash or turning this kind of conversation into a political issue when we really engage at that level. So that's what I think is super powerful.
Great, thanks, Ashley. Really good example there. I'm going to turn to you now, Patrick. If we sort of just switch the current agricultural system to 100% regenerative, would that be enough?
Well, it depends on what you mean. Depends on what you mean by regenerative. There's this buzzword, regenerative agriculture, that presumes that somehow covering the land with cows is actually going to be a good thing for climate, and frankly, it's complete BS. And I'm a scientist, and I pay a lot of attention to scientific evidence, and frankly, the overwhelming weight of the scientific evidence is that, if anything, you know, well, first of all, that covering the landscape with livestock is an unmitigated disaster, and they're dancing around with their little feet on the soil isn't going to pull a lot of carbon out. So that's my opinion about regenerative agriculture. But on the other hand, there is the concept isn't completely terrible, and I'll get to a second what I think is a tremendously positive future for people who are currently involved in animal farming. I endorse Kevin's statement that, you know, well, both of you said this, that we don't solve the problem by telling farmers what to do. I couldn't agree more. But you can change the incentives, and that's the way it happens. And the way that Impossible Foods is approaching it is just using the market as it exists right now, and changing the incentives there basically by, you know, recognizing that the technology they use is prehistoric. It's incredibly inefficient, not just environmentally but economically compared to what it could be, and it's a sitting duck basically for being replaced by better technology. And so we focused on creating a technology platform that would enable us to make all the foods, the products that consumers want from animals, but to make them without compromising on any aspect, deliciousness, nutrition, affordability, and in fact improving on all those fronts, which is totally doable, putting them on the market and relying on the fact that, well, consumers buy the products that deliver the best value they want, and basically eliminate the economic incentive for covering the world with cows. That's the Impossible Foods, you know, the strategy that we're taking. And again, I won't get into it, but I am 100% confident it's working. We have very compelling proof of concept. But I wanted to talk about something else, if I could have my slide. Oh, I do it myself, sorry. Okay. I wish I could see it. Oh, yeah. Okay. Whoops. Nice work. Okay. And this is the main message I want to talk about at COP. Something that has been completely unrecognized. People recognize, and it's talked about all the time, that animal agriculture is a major source of ongoing greenhouse gas emissions. And the estimates of what fraction of total greenhouse gas emissions come from animal agriculture typically are around 16 to 18%, okay? And that's very significant, and certainly it's worth going after. But that's the wrong way of looking at it, okay? It's the opportunity cost and the huge opportunity that could be unlocked if we phased out animal agriculture. And that's what this slide is about. And I just published a paper on this that is either published or momentarily published. And I'll just take you through it, okay? So again, the key message is eliminating animal agriculture unlocks massive negative emissions. And this is, and can't see the slide, I can't point to it very well, but let's just say the curve at the top, the solid line at the top, is sort of the best estimate from IPCC as to the trajectory we're on, with very, very slow reduction in fossil fuel emissions and basically just relentless increase in atmospheric greenhouse gases. Let's forget about fossil fuels for a moment. If we did nothing about fossil fuels and we just phased out animal agriculture over the next 15 years, and this is based on IPCC and FAO data and just doing the math, okay? We could, as you can see in this slide, if we did this linearly over the next 15 years, by 2030, we would be in a period of 30 years of net zero emissions, even if we did nothing about fossil fuels. That's the magnitude of the negative emissions that could be unlocked. And it's unlocked in 3 ways. Number one, the green sector, so that's the dashed line is where we would be. The green sector is the impact of biomass recovery on the 40% of Earth's land surface that's currently used for animal agriculture. That land, for example, in the UK, it was mostly forest, okay? In other places, it's grasslands, whatever. In the UK, it was largely forested. And if you fly over the UK right now, basically you see 70% of the land is these little flat patches of green with little, you know, remnants of forest surrounding them. The remnants of forest, I will tell you, this land could be a forest very quickly. If you calculate the amount of carbon that could be captured, it's not all forest, but ecosystem by ecosystem, by recovery of the native biomass, the answer is globally the equivalent of about 22 years worth of current fossil fuel emissions, of 2020 fossil fuel emissions, could be pulled out of the atmosphere over a period of just a few decades if we chased away the cows and let the native landscape recover, or didn't chase them away, but basically eliminate the economic incentive for covering the land with cows. The purple sector is methane decay. So the thing about I'll just say is, you can't reverse fossil fuel emissions. You can't turn that carbon dioxide back into coal, okay? You can turn the carbon dioxide from animal agriculture, which is mostly land use change, back into biomass, reversible. The methane emissions are spontaneously reversible because methane decays with a half-life of 9 years, atmospheric methane. That means the minute you turn off the spigot, you get negative emissions. And you can calculate the negative emissions from turning off animal agriculture. And in the first 10 years, you reverse about 8 years of total greenhouse gas emissions through the decay of the methane emitted by livestock. Nitrous oxide is also spontaneously decays in the atmosphere with a longer half-life. That's that red sector. And so you unlock negative emissions through biomass recovery, methane decay, nitrous oxide decay. In aggregate, the negative emissions are enough to give us a 30-year pause in greenhouse gas emissions. And even if we did nothing about fossil fuels, which I sure as hell hope is not the case, offset 68% of fossil fuel emissions through the end of the century by doing this. I want to talk about the impact on farmers because, you know, obviously Impossible Foods is trying to make it impossible for them to make money raising livestock, which would be a good thing, okay? And I have no moral qualms about that. But there's actually an opportunity for farmers that's huge. And that is because you can calculate the earning potential of land as a function of the price of carbon. If there were a global market for carbon. Right now it's just total chaos. There's no standards. It's as if everybody was printing their own money and you know, and selling it twice. But if there were standards and a system, and most economists say more or less the lower limit of a price on carbon that would incentivize the behaviors required to keep us under 2 degrees would be about $50 per ton of CO2. At $50 per ton of CO2, the average hectare of animal ag land globally, the amount of carbon it could capture is something like 4 times the current price of that land, okay? And and most farmers, again, livestock farmers make the margins are very, very low. In England, the earning potential of the land recovering the forest at a carbon price of $50 is many multiples more. 70% of UK farmers would lose money, animal ag farmers would lose money in a year if they weren't for subsidies. So just a baseline set, they're not exactly doing great. They could make like an order of magnitude more money per year if there were a carbon price of $50 by just chasing the cows and sheep away and letting the landscape recover. So it's a win-win in general for farmers. And you don't tell them what to do. I totally agree with you guys. But if they're a carbon price of $50 and they're looking at, their earnings this year raising cattle and sheep versus what they could earn selling carbon offsets into the market, it's a no-brainer. And no compulsion, just opportunity and incentive.
Thanks, Patrick. Did have a question on who wins and who loses, and you're sort of pitching this as a very kind of win-win situation, but just wanted to check, is eliminating animal agriculture actually viable, and within the timescale that you mentioned, 15 years as well?
I wouldn't be saying it, or I wouldn't be devoting my life to it if I didn't think it was going to work. And yes, absolutely. Think of it this way. When a technology comes along that makes what consumers want from a technology more effective in delivering the core functions, in the case of food, its deliciousness and nutrition, and more affordable, the market takes care of it. And just look, more than 100 years ago, when the automobile came on the scene, and no one could imagine that there wouldn't be a horse in every household. Within 15 years, we went from 95% of households owning a horse to about 5% in the U.S. And it was all market-driven because basically, it turns out, people love their horses, but what they mostly loved was that it got them from point A to point B and carried stuff better than they could. The first digital camera was a total piece of crap, okay? It was made by Apple. The first commercial one. It cost $1,000. It could take 8 pictures, and then there were like 100,000 pixels. That's like, a cheap, 1980s phone or something like that. And yet, 8 years later, Kodak was bankrupt. Okay, and you'd have to go to an antique store to find a film camera anymore. So the market works very fast when technology does a better job of serving consumers. There's that. Secondly, I don't have a tremendous confidence that we'll get a functional carbon market, but I think if governments would at least agree on standards for what you have to prove to be able to sell a carbon offset. Okay, you can't just say, hey, I got a tree in my yard, and if I don't cut it down, I want you to pay me $10, which is kind of like how the current market works. If you had a set of standards like the ISO, International Standards Organization, just said, here's the like as if in a financial market, here's the criteria you have to meet in order to be able to sell into the market. I think you'd have a functional carbon market, and like I say, most people think the equilibrium price would be over $50, in which case, you'd have to be, only hobby farmers would continue having livestock on their land.
Thanks, Patrick. I think we could have a whole talk just on this. It's just really, really fascinating. But what I'm thinking about working in development is behavioral change and how long that sort of all takes. And, in our work, we do a lot of stakeholder engagement. So I'm going to hand over to Ashley, actually. What role do consumers play in all of this?
Yeah, and I was just kind of thinking through that, behavior change, behavior incentives, as you were talking, Patrick. And I was just thinking, what are the downsides of that model, and what keeps me up at night when I'm thinking about, what behavior change does that influence? And I think, there's both something super promising about thinking about what kind of behaviors does a carbon price incentivize, and then there's those knock-on effects that worry me. So I sort of worry for the rest of agriculture. If you get so successful in that, is any farmer going to grow oats? and then how much are we going to have to pay for our oats and our oat milk, And so I think for me it's it'll be really interesting to try to see how to balance this out, how to both incentivize a system where the right practices are done and where you're really putting in place the kind of incentives that are going to lead to a transformational change and a systemic shift, and yet keeping your eyes open to make sure that there aren't these, how do you protect these knock-on effects from happening that in fact do things that you don't you don't want, is to, collapse agriculture entirely and things like that. And I think consumers have such a huge role to play in that and in driving through what they prefer, what they want, what they're interested in. I mean, that's what drove that revolution with digital cameras, which now no one owns anyway, and everyone owns just a camera on their phone, right? Because people wanted that convenience, and that was what was sort of, they were prioritizing. When I hear skepticism, and Patrick, you probably do too, about behavior shift for plant-based food, I'm just like, how can you still be having skepticism when you see what's happening, when you see, all you have to do is look at the numbers and how these things are growing. I had never heard of oat milk like 3 years ago. And now I work for an oat milk company, but it's just the growth is tremendous, and I think speaks for itself and shows that consumer preferences do change. And it's also not all driven by an amazing climate awareness and an amazing environmental awareness, although I do think that is playing a greater role. I think it's also people, being exposed to new options, people being interested in, and learning more about nutrition, learning more about allergens, learning more about the effect that food has on their bodies. I think there's multiple drivers that sort of push consumers to act in a certain way. And to be successful in engaging consumers in that conversation, you have to be open to being able to sort of communicate to them and also engage them in that conversation for whatever is sort of driving their decisions. And you also have to make a good product. So you can have the best argument in the world, you can have the best awareness campaign, the most amazing creative marketing team. You still have to have something that people like and they want, and that to them provides them either something new that's filling this gap, or provides them an alternative to something that they have been having and that they think is actually better than what they're experiencing today. And I think if companies can start thinking in that way about engaging consumers in terms of what can I do to not to just sell the thing that I want to sell them, but what can I do to produce something that's like filling a need or is a solution to some global problems or some challenges that people are facing. That's how we can really sort of engage consumers to help make this shift happen, is instead of providing them what we think they want, really providing them something that is actually filling a need.
Sounds great, Ashley. I'm having flashbacks to the Paris COP and trying insects as an alternative to meat. So it's really good to know that Oatly's here sort of experimenting with oat products and so forth, and really listening to the consumers and engaging with them. That's great. I think, just keeping an eye on the time, coming back to COP26 and the negotiations taking place over these 2 weeks, what specific policy mechanisms are needed to drive forward sustainable food systems? And since we don't have much time, I would ask that each of you just kind of share one example. So maybe if I start with, I'll start with you, Ashley, if you could begin.
Yeah, I think there's so many areas that we need policy action in the food sector, but I'll just pick up on the one that Patrick briefly mentioned, which is the subsidies, because it's the most controversial one. But I think the area of market distortions, and there's been a few reports out now recently on just subsidies in the livestock sector and how that's distorting the system. I think that is probably one of the most controversial, but also one of the most powerful areas where governments really can take a look. And I think the policymakers that are here are no stranger to this, right? I mean, they are tackling the subsidy issue in the fossil fuel industry, right? So why is that concept in the food industry such a no-go area? And that, to me, that is probably one of the most powerful. Like, let's just level the playing field. That's not even talking about doing something fundamentally different. That's just talking about leveling the playing field.
great point, Ashley. Over to you, Kevin.
Yeah, I mean, ironically, I think I would say the same thing. I think, and I think the good news here is that, there's a lot of examples where we have subsidies that have been designed to solve a different problem than the one that we think is the most important problem to solve now. And in some cases, so if you look at things like, particularly in the U.S., things like crop insurance, the things that you need to do to be eligible for crop insurance to demonstrate your low risk are use lots of synthetic inputs, because that's what's going to guarantee your yield, which makes you a lower risk, investment, which is not wrong, but it hasn't factored in some of the other stuff that we now care about, right? From a risk point of view, that is true. If you have lots of inputs, your yield will be more reliable. You will also have a bigger carbon footprint, and now we care about that too. And so we just need we just need a more modern subsidy system that says, oh, if you've done things to build your soil carbon, your soil will do a better job of holding water, which means you'll have less yield variability, which makes you, in sharp, pointy pencil actuarial terms, a lower risk, and therefore you should be a lower insurance premium. That's not how it works today, right? So there's very, almost sort of not philosophical, but just analytical opportunities to adjust some of the policy subsidy, the ag subsidy schemes to accomplish the goals that we now care about.
Great, thanks. And Patrick, one example of a specific policy mechanism as we're here at COP.
Sure. Well, again, what I'll say is that if there were a properly regulated, i.e. you just can't make stuff up, market for carbon offsets at $50 a ton of CO2, or even lower rates, that's not targeted at anyone. It's not we're going after beef, we're going after, the oil industry or anyone. If we just had a policy like that simply says society values avoiding a climate catastrophe, and presumably you can agree on that, and is willing to spend some money on it, which is very modest fraction of global GDP, to achieve that goal, it would be game changing. It's effectively saying, look, everybody wants this. To have it happen in a global way requires some government. It doesn't require government action. That's why Impossible Foods exists, because we don't depend on government action, but it would benefit from government action. It would be non-discriminatory against any sector of industry. It's just saying we want less carbon. And basically, to be honest, it would put the livestock out of business in a heartbeat.
Great. So what we've heard is around sort of reviewing how we do subsidies, and also around the carbon sort of offset market as well. Just to close, if your companies are truly climate leaders, what are you doing to influence the private and public sector beyond your supply chain? And what examples of collection action do you have? I think, Kevin, you may have mentioned some at the beginning, but yeah, if I could start with you to talk us through.
Yeah, so the one I mentioned at the start was the Forest Positive Coalition of Action, which is a number of the large consumer goods manufacturing and retail companies working to tackle deforestation. The other one that I'll throw out there is as Mars, we have been, for more than a decade, deeply involved in a lot of the development of exactly what Patrick was talking about, all the accounting protocols and standards for the rules of when you're a corporate and you do your carbon footprinting, what has to be in there, how do you have to do the math? And so requiring that those footprints include GHG emissions from land use change and agriculture more generally. Requiring that the SBTI net zero, ever evolving SBTI standards have fewer and fewer and smaller loopholes for what greenhouse gas emissions can be excluded. And I guess maybe the last thing I'll say, which sort of picks up on the point Patrick made, is we don't actually want the farmers in our supply chains selling carbon attributes in the offset market. We want them selling those reductions in emissions to us attached to the crops that we buy, right? And we're prepared to value and reward that, because we, like many others, have made a net zero commitment, and if we aren't getting those reductions in our value chain, we're gonna have to go pay someone somewhere else to go plant a tree. And frankly, we'll do some of that, but I would rather pay my farmer for both the raw material that I'm buying and carbon that they're delivering, and then it just becomes another attribute of what we're sourcing from them. And we and every other food company should absolutely be expecting to be paying for that, because we know if we don't, we're going to be buying carbon credits somewhere else. So it's a cost that's coming anyways, even if there isn't regulation, which I very much hope there will be. but I mean, that's the future that we're headed for.
Great, and I'm glad you mentioned transparency and the important role that sort of plays in all of this as well. Patrick, sort of your influence beyond for the private and public sector beyond your supply chain and examples of collective action.
Well, yeah, so again, the number one thing that we have control over is eliminating the financial incentives for animal farming, and I think that's the most certain and powerful way. But I think a thing that could be done that seems less drastic than get an international agreement to tax or tariff or whatever that prices carbon at $50 a ton or whatever it is, would be to simply, and this is related to what Kevin said, simply have some internationally agreed upon standards that for what conditions need to be met for some carbon offset to be valued as such. And that means verifiable, negative carbon impact, well, even if it's just CO2, carbon storage, and a criterion for permanence. Like, you can't just, grow a tree and chop it down and do that every year and just turn the crank on carbon offsets without actually doing anything. So I think if there were if we just had agreed upon standards, that would be incredibly subversive, because the market that now is completely broken and dysfunctional would actually be starting to work, and it would be something then that would make it a lot easier for international organizations to buy into.
Great, thanks. And Ashley, I'll give the last word to you.
Yeah, I'll be really quick just in case anyone in the audience has questions. So I'll take a little bit different tack. I think, there's a lot of great collective action platforms out there for companies that are growing. I think the Science-Based Targets Initiative is one of them that's really taken off, which is more like collective individual action, kind of, because it's just individual action, but you're putting it on a shared platform. The Sustainable Agriculture Platform, SCI platform, we found that very valuable to sort of share experiences and share sustainable agriculture approaches with other companies. But I actually want to take a different tack and mention how you can actually have collaborative action with consumers to get something done. And two areas that we've engaged in the policy space with consumers and really sort of like brought in that power of kind of like the people's voice into policies is, one is not environment or climate related. It was called Amendment, well, kind of indirectly. It was called Amendment 171 in Europe. It was a European Commission amendment that was going to make it super, super restrictive for how companies that weren't producing something that was traditional dairy product could use dairy type words, like to use creamy or to say not milk. Like, it was going to ban basically companies from explaining their product in that way. And then other things like packaging couldn't look the same and all that kind of stuff. And we saw it as a direct threat to Oatly, and so we engaged with consumers, had a petition in Europe, over 500,000 people signed, engaged with several policymakers, and it didn't pass. Several companies as part of plant-based alliances signed on, and so I think you truly can have a difference as a company. It doesn't always have to be that behind closed doors lobbying type way. You can actually engage people in their voice. And we're doing a similar thing around carbon footprinting. So engaging people, for example, in Germany, where there's a lot of interest among people to have the carbon information for their products, and engaging the Bundestag, engaging the policymakers on, should this be mandatory? We want there to be some kind of carbon label on food or, on any consumer products. The people here want it, they understand it, they're knowledgeable about climate change, and they want to know. And so I think that you can really engage people in that kind of collective action policy engagement space.
Thanks, Ashley. We've only got a few minutes left. Does anyone in the audience have any questions? Thank you, the gentleman there.
A question for Patrick. You know, obviously in the United States we grow a tremendous amount of corn and beans for livestock agriculture. So if we don't use that land for that purpose, if we allow that land to go back into succession for carbon sequestration, is there any role for farmers, or are they just collecting rent going forward?
Yeah, it's a complicated question. So first of all, if the way that we're producing our products, let's say, and the way Oatly is and so forth, couldn't do it without farmers. So there is a role for farmers. But I think what you're talking about is specifically the farmers who are part of the supply chain of animal agriculture, if that were to go away. And that's a good question. This is one of the reasons why I'm such an advocate for, if there were for a market for carbon offsets. Because, and you may say, well, you know, all I want to do is plant corn and harvest it and so forth, but there's a livelihood for farmers that either have grazing livestock or are growing feed crops, and that is managing the recovery of the land. So a farmer who knows their land and knows a lot more about, you know, managing plant growth and stuff like that than you know, an average person, is exactly who you would want to effectively hire to do this, okay? And you might say, yeah, but who would, know, how do you pay for it? Well, there, you know, if there were ever a market, first of all, on carbon recovery alone, there's land in the US that you could buy for $1,000 an acre that has the potential to capture $40,000 worth of carbon if there were a $50 a ton price. And most of the land in the US actually could capture carbon way in excess of what you could buy the land for in a functional carbon market. So I think there's a huge opportunity for farmers, but I think there's no future in growing crops that whose sole purpose is to feed pigs and chickens and cows. But it's a different way of making a living, but I don't think it has to be any less rewarding. And once the land has recovered, just maintaining that land, I don't mean plowing and planting and stuff like that, but you know, keeping it as a healthy wild ecosystem, I think there's a societal value for that, and that means there could be you could make a living at it if there were a price on carbon, and especially if there were a price on biodiversity. I know it's very hypothetical, but I guess what I would say is, I think, and I've talked to a lot about farmers about this, that sort of feel the same way. The market, without any government intervention, I think is going to drastically reduce the earning potential of people who are solely in the animal and agriculture industry. So it's important to start thinking about how do they make a living in a world where, you know, massive amounts of corn and soybeans isn't valued.
Great. Sorry, I think we're on time now, so I'm afraid no more questions, but hopefully the speakers will be around and you can ask them after this session. Just want to thank you all for joining us, and a special thanks to our speakers today. It's been really interesting and great to hear what you're sort of doing. I think just to kind of summarize, what I'm really hearing is just pushing for those standards and that regulation in order to do this at scale. It can't really rely on voluntary sort of actions anymore. Level the playing field when it comes to subsidies. That was another key point. And then I think the carbon markets is obviously a complicated one. Article 6, we all know, is being fiercely negotiated, I'm sure, in the halls. But it sounds like, you know, food really needs to be on that map, as it needs to be on that sort of wider climate action map as well. So really thank you all. I mean, we've got so much work to do. I think the other major thing we heard here is collaboration, and not just with each other. That's a lot of what we do in our work, sort of peer sharing and learning, but also with our consumers and other actors in all of this. Thanks everyone so much. Really thank you to our speakers, and hope you have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you.